Welcome, everybody. My name is 𝗗𝗆𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. This is part of our webinar series with WIMSA, and today we will be talking about safety and enhancing safety culture in the mining operations. I will be co-hosting this event with Chantal, who will also introduce herself shortly from SafetyCloud, and they are our partners in this particular webinar series. Chantal?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar service. Looking forward to seeing how we can continue to add value to industry and to WIMSA as we explore some very critical topics that have an impact for all women in mining, and hoping we can impact positively on these very serious challenges. So looking forward to seeing what our panelists have to say and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantal. And we are joined by very highly esteemed speakers who are experts in the field and will be also sharing their knowledge. I will introduce each speaker as they come on to give us their address. And the title for today's webinar is Ensuring Safety and Addressing Gender-Based Violence in Mining. And we really encourage you to continue sharing comments and questions. And at the end of the presentations from our speakers, we will then go into those questions and have an in-depth discussion on your questions. Gender-based violence remains a pervasive issue in South Africa, with the mining industry being particularly affected. And the Minerals Council has acknowledged this and the fact that GBV and harassment are significant concerns within the industry, where women often face violence, harassment, and intimidation at work. The isolated, often remote, traditionally male-dominated nature of mining operation can exacerbate vulnerabilities, making it imperative for us to address these issues head-on. And in this webinar, we'll be exploring critical themes around the impact of GBV on women in mining, strategies for fostering safe and inclusive work environment, resources available to support victims, and legal consequences on non-compliance, and ending with a group discussion where we will invite the audience to share their stories as well as initiatives that are in their respective areas of work around addressing GBV. And in our speakers today, I'm going to first call upon Mbali Nkosi. Mbali Nkosi is a senior associate at the Webber Wentzel. She specializes in occupational health and safety as well as employment law, bringing a wealth of expertise in today's discussion. Her extensive experience includes drafting employment contracts and work-related policies, advising on equal pay disputes and conducting investigations and inquiries related to workplace fatalities. She has provided invaluable occupational health and safety law advice and training, particularly within the mining industry and construction industries. And these sectors are really crucial for our economy. Mbali's background also includes in-house experience with the Africa's largest multinational mobile telecommunications provider, giving her a diverse perspective on the application of legal principles in real-world scenarios. Mbali holds an LLB degree with distinction from the University of Witwatersrand and is an admitted attorney of the High Court of South Africa. She's also a proud member of the Black Lawyers Association, reflecting her commitment to advancing equality and excellence in legal profession. And she will also be discussing consequences of non-compliance with gender-based violence regulations in the South African mining industry. Mbali, I would like to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the host for inviting me today. So I'm going to talk briefly about specifically the new mandatory code of practice that has come into play with regards to the management of gender-based violence and femicide, as well as safety and security challenges within the mining industry. Now, as we all know, from a legal perspective, employers have a duty of care to their employees, but more so under the MHSA have an obligation to ensure that employees are protected from the operations or the risk of exposures within their operations. In addition to that, in addition to the MHSA and the obligations under the MHSA, we have the Employment Equity Act. The Employment Equity Act deals with unfair discrimination and the fact that employers have a duty to take proactive steps to protect employees from unfair discrimination, which, by the way, sexual harassment is defined as as unfair discrimination under the Employment Equity Act. What the EEA says is that employers must take proactive, reasonable steps to protect employees from unfair discrimination, but also take reasonable steps to conduct investigations where complaints of sexual harassment have occurred. What we now see happening in the law is there's a new mandatory code of practice that's been issued by the Chief Inspector of Mines that actually places even more obligations on the employer to implement strategic plans as well as implementation plans with regard to managing GBVF within the mining industry. What this MCOP now does is it requires the employer to do more than just put in a policy that says we have a zero tolerance approach to sexual harassment or unfair discrimination. It actually requires an employer to decide on a budget that will go towards GBVF issues and implementation plan. It requires the employer to report on GBVF incidents to the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. It requires the employer to train employees on GBVF and safety security challenges, as well as requires the employer to implement quite specific interventions that it must take to protect women in mining as a whole when it comes to GBVF challenges and security and safety challenges. Now, in this MCOP, which, by the way, came into effect as of the 1st of November, 2024, which means that mines all over the country must have started adopting this MCOP, preparing as well as implementing some of its plans that it's come up with. What the mines and employers need to do is put together a committee, right, that will deal with these issues, that will monitor GBVF within the mining communities and surrounding communities, as well as within the workplace itself. The consequences of not complying with this MCOP is obviously that non-compliance with the MCOP is non-compliance with the MHSA. There has been an MCOP that's been introduced, which employers need to comply with. And the MCOP was effective as of 1 November 2024. It has an array of obligations that the employer needs to now implement in terms of that MCOP, including the fact that the employer must implement strategic systems and interventions to prevent, manage, eliminate, and mitigate any GBVF incidents. I think I'll pause here for now. And if there are any questions on the MCOP or legislation, then we'll deal with them as they go. Apologies for that.
No worries. Thank you so much. You've really educated us around the legal framework and what's available. Could you also just touch on consequences for non-compliance and looking at individual consequence at the manager level in the operations as an example, as well as at an organizational level, given the risk MCOP?
Yes, okay. So the MCOP has specific obligations for the employer, as well as specific obligations for managers and supervisors. Now, if managers and supervisors don't comply with those obligations, then the employer must, and this is part of the policies and procedures that the employer must implement, must somehow deal with that manager or supervisor through disciplinary action. That is the same for any employee that is either, found guilty of GBVF incidences, sexual harassment, harassment of any kind, or unfair discrimination. The employer must take steps necessary to deal with that individual. Now, from an organizational perspective, if an organization does not comply with the MCOP or the Employment Equity Act, then the normal penalties based on legislation apply. So for the EEA, for example, you as an employer, you are either taken to the labor court or the CCMA, where an unfair discrimination case is raised against you. You will have to defend that claim. Whereas under the MCOP, if an inspector comes onto your site and finds that you're not complying with the MCOP, then they can issue you with the normal enforcement actions which they have. So either an instruction under Section 55 of the MHSA for the employer to comply, or a Section 54 where they halt operations until the employer complies. There are also others, such as an administrative fine. So your normal legislative penalties would apply for an organization, which is why it's very important for the employer to make sure that supervisors, managers are doing exactly what they need to do under that act, but also that employees are also following the processes and procedures.
Okay, that is very clear, and thank you for that. And on the organizational level, could you also just tell us more around how organizations can or may not be held accountable for incidents happening, whether outside the organization or not, to their employees, and touch on these events happening at work-related events in their homes? How are companies held accountable or liable for such incidents?
Well, since COVID, I think we've all realized that the workplace, or the definition of a workplace, is no longer limited to just the office or the site when employee is working. Anything that relates to your employer, if your employer took you to an off-site meeting or an event, like we have Christmas parties coming up now, if they take you to an event or a venue, and something happens there, then employers are liable for what happens. So it's not just about what happens in the course and scope of your employment, but if anything that is linked to your employer, if your employer is taking you there, then the employer will be liable. It's very important for the employer to, you know, implement risk assessments with regards to this as well, taking this into account, because you don't want a situation where employees are unfairly discriminated against, harassed, sexually harassed, and you don't have measures in place to protect them. So yes, employers can be liable, even in situations where a recent case that we did where the employee was abused by her husband at a mine-provided accommodation. The employer had to take swift actions to ensure that the employee and the perpetrator were separated until an investigation was done, as well as for the South African Police Services to do their leg of their investigation. So employers can be liable and must take note of this.
Yeah, wow. And what lessons can we learn from such incidents happening in organizations around organizations facing lawsuits or reputational damage due to such incidents?
I think first and foremost, the lesson that we need to learn is this must be more than just a legal compliance issue. It must be more than just a tick box exercise of, do we now comply with this MCOP? Because we often find that companies that get into trouble reputationally and otherwise are those that don't take this seriously, or those that just comply with the law and don't actually implement this within their culture, right? Within their work culture. So, number one, be proactive. Don't just look at what the law is saying, but if you can go beyond that, do so, because that will also impact on your, your ESG structures and just your overall culture and reputation as a company. Secondly, make sure that your policies and procedures are updated. Make sure that they are clear and they speak to exactly what the legal framework currently says, that you don't have any sort of confusion around what your internal policies say versus what the law now says. And last but not least, take every complaint around harassment seriously, because I think the very famous case of Liberty, where they actually allowed an employee to resign and not deal with her complaints. She then took them to the labor court, and they unfortunately had to pay around 3 million rand in damages. And that's a popular case. We don't have to be private around it. If you could Google it, you'll find it. So I think it's very essential for companies to be proactive and do what they need to do, not only in terms of the law, but what is right in society. Those are the lessons I'd say.
Yeah, and what should mining companies be doing around continuing to educate, train, and ensure that their employees understand what gender-based violence, harassment, and bullying is and how they should behave as part of their organization?
I think employers must never take it for granted that their employees know what harassment is. We often find when we conduct training for companies, a lot of employees who have even experienced harassment themselves don't even know that what happened to them was harassment. So I think we must never take it for granted that employees know what it is, have continuous training, have it as part of your induction, as part of your safety talks, have it be part of your work culture, just like other safety issues. GBV, harassment should be one of those topics that are constantly being spoken about in as part of your induction, in your health and safety committees at every level and at every forum. Make sure that this is front and center of mind of employees. And I think having a culture where people know exactly what the rules are often protects victims or potential victims, because perpetrators are more wary of the fact that people know that their behavior is unacceptable. So accepting, or rather implementing, a zero tolerance approach must be more than just, putting it on your billboards, but it must be something that's spoken about and implemented on a daily basis.
Yeah, and that speaks to the safety culture that we are really talking about here. And would like to just hear, in organizations or companies where there's conflict between the internal policies and legal framework regarding gender-based violence, what should they be doing? Because, I mean, that is putting employees at risk.
Absolutely. I want to say first and foremost that the legislation and the law and this MCOP will always trump the internal policies. So it's very important for employers to understand what this new MCOP says. And believe me, it has a lot of obligations that one needs to sit and actually digest and dissect. If your internal policies do not align with that MCOP, then you're sitting with a problem, because obviously you're not compliant if your internal policies do not align, but also you may be sending mixed messages because the law is saying one thing and yet your internal policies are saying another. So I think it's very important for employers to ensure that whatever internal, policies they have in place and procedures, they align with the law.
Thank you so much, Mbali, for that. And my last question to you is really around, ethical and governance responsibilities and how compliance to addressing gender-based violence should be treated, and what should organizations be doing to ensure that they are on the right side of the law, but also creating a safe culture as you wrap up.
I think the two are very interconnected. It's almost as though you can't separate it, because GBV is now recognized as a fundamental right, or rather GBV is it's a heinous crime. It's in fact defined as a hyper-endemic, and it is one of the things that a company will look at when they are assessing, ESG, the kind of governance that you have in your workplace. So the two are very interconnected. Focusing on ensuring that you comply with the MCOP in general will assist you with your ethical and governance issues around the social aspects of ESG, not just ESG, but just the kind of companies that we want to have and the organizations we want to have that focus on human rights within their organizations. So the two are very interconnected.
And I would like to really agree with you on that one, that safety culture is really around how employees feel when they have to wake up every day and go to work. And it's important that we don't do it just for compliance, but as a way of life. And I'm going to just say thank you so much, Mbali. And thank you everyone for your questions. I see them in the chat. If you've just joined us, we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the webinar after all our speakers have delivered their addresses. And I'm going to just encourage our speakers to keep an eye on the chat and maybe start answering some of the questions in the chat. And I think we've touched on some of them in that conversation. Thank you so much, Mbali.
Thank you.
Up next, please help me welcome Vanessa Doble, who's the head of Living with Dignity Hub at Anglo American. She is a trailblazer in creating safer, more inclusive workplaces. A groundbreaking, she's leading the Living with Dignity Hub at Anglo American, which is a groundbreaking program designed to foster a zero-tolerance approach to GBV, sexual harassment, bullying, victimization, and domestic violence within the workplace. Under her leadership, the Living with Dignity Hub prioritizes a survivor-centered approach, ensuring that complaints are handled with sensitivity, confidentiality, and fairness. This initiative has become a cornerstone of Anglo American's commitment to creating supportive environments for all employees. Vanessa brings over 24 years of professional experience to her role as an admitted attorney, with a distinguished career that includes consulting for global organizations such as the World Bank and the Open Society Foundation. Prior to joining Anglo American, she served as the head of legal and compliance for South African Rugby Union, where she led transformative projects like the Women in Sports Leadership Initiative and a comprehensive safeguarding program for the organization. Some of her accolades include a master's degree in social innovation from the University of Cambridge Judge Business School, and earlier qualifications of BA, LLB, and LLM from the University of Cape Town. Vanessa is also a member of the World Rugby Council and World Rugby Women's Player Welfare Committee, reflecting her passion for driving systemic change and advocating for vulnerable groups. And today, she will be speaking on resources available for victims of gender-based violence within the South African mining industry, sharing her expertise on how organizations can better support survivors in driving meaningful action. Please welcome me, Vanessa. Hi, Vanessa, welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction.
just take us into what type of resources are available for victims of GBV within the industry, and how can they access them?
So generally, I'm going to talk from an Anglo-American perspective. Sorry, I'm just making sure, can everybody hear me and there's no echo? Okay, fantastic.
Great.
I'm going to talk generally around an Anglo-American perspective and how we've approached it, and hopefully use this opportunity to learn from other mining companies that are here. Certainly, we know that we don't have a blueprint. Nobody has a blueprint. And we're developing an ecosystem to ensure that as a sector, we really are able to shift the dial on GBVF, how we've dealt with it, and how we can empower our workforce, our employees, our communities, our families, really to live in safe communities. And the one thing that I was just reflecting on before I get to the response is that I attended a conference last week, and we were reflecting on the death of Pinky Mosimane, who passed away in 2011. I think you might all remember that was a horrific and really violent GBVF incident at one of the mines where she was raped and found and subsequently died a couple of days later. So there's just a moment of silence to acknowledge, the pain, the hurt that comes with GBVF. In this instance, in our mining community, society at large, it's a global pandemic. From an Anglo-American perspective, we just want to really pay tribute to the women and men, but given that it's a WIMSA function, the women that have done incredible work to get us to this point where we are today, where we are able to talk about the DMRE creating an MCOP, where we're able to talk about the guidelines and to really bring our collective expertise together to try and figure out how we're going to negotiate and navigate this path. So the response mechanisms that are usually available within an organization might typically sit within your P&O function. They might typically sit within your whistleblowing channels. They might be there within your EAP service providers. They might be there with your health practitioners. They might be there structured in various committees that deal with this issue. So particularly if we look at an organization like Platinum that has set up very specific GBV advisory panels and councils to deal with this issue. Or within the case of Anglo-American, they are set up within the Living with Dignity Hub. Now, how the hub is structured is that it's an independent, specialized unit that has been set up to deal with dignity harms. And dignity harms in that context is gender-based violence, sexual harassment, bullying, harassment, victimization, domestic violence, racism. And if any of our employees, so within the workforce, if you experience any of these dignity harms, we serve as a response unit, meaning that you bring these complaints through to the hub and we will provide end-to-end case management services. I know that the hub is unique in its setup, so it's not widely known across the private sector, certainly, and even within the global space. So really what we're trying to do is develop an innovative, unique structure that can make sure that victims are supported, that we drive a zero tolerance strategy, and that we remain independent, ensuring fair processes, outcomes in terms of how we deal with these issues.
Thank you so much for giving that information on the hub. And I think, I look forward to also seeing what other mining companies are doing in this so that we understand the extent of, resources available across the industry to our other colleagues. And we also would like you to just tell us about what challenges companies are facing around creating meaningful support for victims. In your experience at the hub around victim centralized support.
Yeah. So Mbali spoke really brilliantly about this MCOP, and I think all the companies that are sitting here are probably trying to figure out how are we going to ensure compliance, and not only just compliance for the sake of a tick box exercise, but really bring about meaningful change. Now, GBVF is a specialized area, and it's not akin to any of the other areas probably that we are accustomed to in engineering and mining. So the one thing that I think is really difficult to conceptualize is that it's an intractable, wicked problem which means that it needs a significant amount of time, understanding, and compassion to invest in it in order to see effective change. So I think that has been one of the biggest sort of stumbling blocks. If we create a solution around this, then surely we'll be able to see significant change. Changing people's behavior, changing organizational culture, we know, is a lengthy process. So I think coming in specifically to an area which is complex, which has been there for a while, which traverses this interesting private-public line. And what we have been forced to do as companies is to step into what some might term as the private space. So Mbali indicated that the workplace is no longer defined as where you go from 9 to 5 into a particular building, but it spills over into all of these other areas. So when we look at domestic violence, and we're really trying to figure out how do we bring it in, how do we apply our zero tolerance approach in this particular context, it means that we really need to try and apply a different focus and a different lens to how we approach this work. Then secondly, I think the issue around awareness and understanding, that has been a big learning from us in the Hub. People don't really know what is inappropriate and appropriate conduct within the context of, and I'm going to put it in brackets, the workplace. So gender norms, and we certainly learned from the recent research that HSRC did around what is acceptable, what is the role of a woman, how do you engage? So in trying to ensure that we build a common understanding and shared knowledge base, we have to unlearn a whole series of things that might have appeared to us as completely normal before in order to create a new. So that awareness building, that training, that understanding, that approach with empathy is absolutely critical. And lastly, I'd say that the leadership commitment. So we have been absolutely fortunate at Anglo American to have our senior leadership buy into the strategy, buy into this, because I don't think you're able to effect change if your leaders aren't talking this talk and walking this walk. If they're not modeling the behavior that they want all employees throughout an organization to see. So that leadership commitment, that buy-in is absolutely fundamental to driving this work.
Thank you, Vanessa, for that. And you know, it's like you said, it's a very complex topic. And for mining, most of our mining sites are in remote areas, and the hub may be centralized, but could you just tell us how you are able to support Anglo-American employees even in remote areas, and how do they access the resources that are available? And perhaps touch on other national resources that may be of use to other employees in remote areas?
Yeah, so from a Hub perspective, in terms of how we've always envisioned this, is that we need to have an integrated strategy. We need to recognize that we're not the only part of the ecosystem, but that there's a significant part of players that are able to facilitate and support this work. So I would strongly encourage that for any sort of lens that you approach. So who are the partners within those particular areas that you can really partner up with to ensure that we have a holistic service offering? Our intended perspective is one that is a trauma-informed approach, meaning that we look at this holistically. So are the NGOs working in these communities that specifically deal with violence or perpetrators of violence? Who are the local agencies there? Who are the police and associated obviously with the criminal justice system? And then a bigger process or project that we've been involved in through the Minerals Council, along with some of the other mining houses, has really been to support and capacitate state structures that are tasked with doing this work. And in this regard, I'm referring to the Thuthuzela care centers. So we have certainly ensured that we support the development of those centers and the increase of those centers throughout the country. But those centers are, for those colleagues who might not be aware, are one-stop shops effectively psychosocial support, linking up with police services, medical legal intervention that the 𝗔𝗱𝗱𝗿𝗲𝗀𝗃 care centers take care of within the particular regions that they occupy. They are under the NPA and very specifically driven through the SOCA, the Sexual Offences and Community Affairs Unit. So intentionally, we've partnered up with them because a lot of the expertise, when you come into the system and you've experienced the trauma that sits with it, and you have the choices, the multiple choices around whether you want to report, whether you want to just receive support. What are the options that are available, and who are those partners that can then facilitate to ensure that those referral pathways that we guide you through are available to you? So that would be a significant strategy around a partnership model in related areas.
Yeah, and that is probably one of the biggest challenges, because you've just outlined, being a victim and finding yourself in a place where you need to report, you do need to have a safe environment for you to be able to do that, and to have the comfort that you will be supported. And just reporting is a big step. What are steps that companies can take to overcome the cultural and structural barriers that prevent victims from seeking help?
So I think probably the 4 that I would highlight as areas that can be considered. The first is really around this public awareness and the education. So normalize reporting and do it through the various ways that you are able to engage with employees. So it doesn't become a stigma to put your hand up and say, I'm seeing this conduct, it's wrong. It becomes the organizational culture, the way that we do things within this organization. Secondly, in that regard, I think you need to apply a different lens. So you need to ensure that you create empathy and support. That takes a victim-centered / people-centered approach. And it's because people are concerned about various things in relation to reporting. Firstly, the confidentiality processes. So how do you ensure that the confidentiality will be guaranteed? And in this way, you might start thinking about, do we create external reporting or independent reporting channels? Or do we have independent investigators that are able to support this so that employees don't feel, and I think it's a huge issue around the real fear of victimization or retribution once you put your hand up and you say, this is what's happening and this is wrong. And a recent example might just indicate just some of the barriers, the barriers that exist for victims, survivors, complainants, reporters that we might not automatically see. In one of the instances that we had, which was quite a traumatic, a violent incident that occurred off-site, but impacted our employee, and where we mobilized and provided the support, we found that when the employee came back into the workplace, it wasn't necessarily the trauma around the experience that people were now beginning to question, but it was how they were engaging with this particular employee that was completely traumatizing for her, given the experience that she had just had. So how do we build a culture within the organization that understands what trauma is, how to respond to trauma, how to support employees who've suffered these incidences? And then I think the policies, and Mpali spoke about, the policies really need to be in place, and people need to believe that the policies that are in place are the policies that will be applied regardless of grading within the organization or affiliation, that really we build the zero tolerance through these are the policies, these are the consequence management, and this is how we communicate the outcomes of what we have done. And then I've spoken about ensuring that the leadership is supportive of the initiative. And I think then you also need to think very intentionally about your different constituencies that are impacted. And in this way, you can ensure that your training is really, really impactful. And, by way of example, for employees from the LGBTQI+ community, how do you ensure that the language that you use, the experiences that you're referring to are inclusive of their experiences? or employees with disabilities. So it's really intentional thinking and planning behind how we execute this.
Thank you so much for that, Vanessa. And what role can unions and worker associations play in improving access to the resources and just ensuring that we collaborate in creating a safe working environment?
So the unions as partners are absolutely fundamentally critical stakeholders in walking this journey with you. And I think through the constituency base that they have, they're able to exercise significant influence. They're also able to educate and train, and they're also able to act as safeguards where they see that we are not living the values of the organization. Taking them along, and as we have done through the tripartite structures that we've had, means that we are able to also design interventions where we might have blind spots, and they're able to ensure that they can point out areas that we might traditionally have ignored as critical fundamental areas, so that we design a solution that speaks to the issue that we're trying to address. I think so often we come in and we think we've got the solution, we've got the answers, and now it's about implementation, when really those critical stakeholders are critical constituencies in terms of designing a solution that works. So partnering up with the unions is absolutely non-negotiable if we intend to do this work properly.
And you've already touched on stigmatization. And what else would you like to maybe add on around just dealing with that and busting the stigma so that we can encourage victims to come forward without fear?
Yeah. So I think if you think about the different ways in which we can do that, it's, I mean, fundamentally about building trust. So it's the structures that work or the reporting channels that work. We communicate back to employees that if this is what happens here, there are consequences that will follow. We ensure that you have confidential reporting channels. Confidentiality is probably our second biggest asked questions when we do the road shows, and we've gone and reached approximately 8,000 to 10,000 people this year in rolling out awareness campaigns. And confidentiality how can I be sure that you will treat this with confidentiality? The others is really just ensuring that people have agency. So I'm a firm believer that, and I'm saying this because I'm a little bit hesitant, not all matters are suited to the strict legal approach of investigations. I think some matters can be resolved in other ways that are more effective and less traumatic. And I'm talking about a particular suite of matters. I think for certain matters, it's absolutely non-negotiable that you go through quite a rigorous legal process to ensure a fair outcome for all parties. And I think probably one of the other ways that we are thinking about it now, and certainly I'd love to hear from colleagues on the call, is about building allies or building ambassadors on the ground who then become the champions for this work and who provide the safety net for employees who really want to ensure that they're able to speak without fear in exposing some of the harms that they are experiencing. And then it's transparency. So we need to be quite intentional that we are transparent in our approach and in how we do this work.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that. And as we wrap up, I would like you to just tell us from your experience, what do you think should be the next steps for the industries, particularly in South Africa, in order to create a more supportive and responsive environment for gender-based violence victims?
Yeah, so I think the one, probably if this is a journey that's completely new to you, I think the starting point for me would be really to get your head around the DMRE regulations for particularly this sector. So I really think that I would encourage you to have a very clear understanding of what that looks like. Then secondly, I think is to build your implementation plan around some of the significant learnings that have already been done in this space. So in your implementation plan, what are the critical things that you need to be taking into consideration? Do you understand this environment? And if you don't understand this environment, how do you bring on board specialists and experts that can help you craft an implementation plan that will have sustainable impact in terms of how you execute it? How do you begin to create awareness? And in that process, how do you ensure that your entire leadership team is behind this journey and supports this journey? And then how do you cascade that down? So certainly from the CEO level to the GM level, to the supervisor, to the form, how do you ensure that all of those structures are beginning to mobilize and move in one direction around resolving these issues? And then clearly, how do your policies align with what is required, and where there are significant gaps, how do you begin to close those gaps? And then thirdly, I would say ask. This is your workforce, this is your population. So I would really encourage companies to make sure that they engage with employees around what they believe are solutions to addressing this really wicked problem.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for sharing great insights and the work you've done within Anglo-American and outside around this. And thank you so much for our attendees for staying with us. We encourage you to continue sending your questions. We'll start answering them in the chat, and at the end of the presentations, we'll then go through all the questions. And in our next, the next panelist is going to be talking on the impact of GBV on women in mining and the strategies for fostering a safe and inclusive work environment. And our speaker is Krista Pistorius, and she is compliance officer for SafetyCloud. Krista is an accomplished leader in occupational health, safety, and environmental management, currently serving as the Group Compliance Group Compliance Officer, please pardon me, HSE for Safety South Africa. With a remarkable career spanning over 4 decades, Krista has dedicated her expertise to ensuring workplace safety and compliance across industries. Her journey includes pivotal roles at NOSA, where she excelled as sales manager for the coastal region and regional manager for the Western Cape and Namibia, overseeing multiple offices and teams while driving regional growth and operational excellence. Her experience extends to conducting health and safety audits across Africa, spearheading projects for international clients, and leading training and consulting initiatives in diverse sectors, including nuclear power and industrial gases. Krista's academic achievements include BTech in occupational nursing and NIBOSH International General Certificate, completed by a wealth of certifications and training in safety and environmental management. She has been recognized for her outstanding contributions, notably as the winner of the NOSA Award for Best Occupational Health Nursing Practitioner. And today, she joins us to talk to us about her unparalleled expertise to Safety South Africa, where she continues to lead with passion, ensuring high standards of health, safety, and environmental compliance across the organization. Welcome, Krista, to the webinar.
Thank you so much, Mokgaleli, and thank you for that introduction. Yes, okay, so I am going to talk firstly about the impact of the gender-based violence on women in mining. And I actually have listed a couple of things. Many of the points that I have raised have been discussed already, but maybe I can just bring some of it together to also suggest a plan. So I think the worst case scenario in terms of what can happen to a person or a female in terms of the GBV is obviously death, and based on assaults, serious assaults, but then also after specific sexual harassment incidents, we can also have possible suicides, which is also resulting in death. And then assaults with different levels of severe injuries. We have mentioned the stigmas that are related to the different types of injuries or assaults. With rape, sexual harassment, we can have actually STDs and HIV. That is also a possibility that can be contracted. And then also, based on the level of the injuries and the assault, such a person can also struggle with infertility for the rest of her life, which is something that we do not think of all the time. Obviously, with such those things goes hospitalization and several tests that needs to be done and conducted. Medical reports need to be compiled to which will be used in cases, but also just to have a history of the medical situation. Mental health challenges. So obviously, and this is possibly before we get to the suicidal situations, a lot of, or even if you do not get to that point, we will definitely have major mental challenges. Stigma will be one of those things. Post-traumatic stress disorder is also a condition that one can suffer with. Again, the stigma can play a role there. And then there might be, depending on what type of assault it has been, long-term medical and psychological treatment necessary. Now I'm thinking of HIV, for example, or STDs. And then there's also the psychological conditions and treatment that might be necessary in such cases. You've also mentioned before that there may be ongoing verbal and physical abuse. There may be ongoing harassment. There may be ongoing intimidation. Sort of a tool, sort of being used as a tool to prevent the people or the exposed person to prevent reporting. With all mentioned above, obviously that will also impact the performance of the employee from a work-related situation, and then also productivity. Definitely social impact from a family point of view, but also then in communities. And then the 2 pointers that's actually relatively very close to heart for me is that, and I'm thinking specifically of women in industry, and my assumption is that it's mainly younger women because they're building their careers. So these are the mothers of the future, and these are our female leaders of the future who have them to carry that burden with them for the rest of their lives, and raise children and be part of a community or a department in a specific organization. Then, so that's that part. Then the strategies and for fostering a safe work environment, a lot has been said about that as well. So my point firstly would be obviously the risk assessment, the safety, health and environmental risk assessment. That is critical. It's a critical point of departure where we need to understand where and what areas these potential risks, health and safety risks are. I just want to mention one thing. So apart from mining, or it probably will be part of the mining industry as well, but in all the other industries, we also these days have lone workers and home workers. So we need to include that in our risk assessments as well, just for the possibility that it can happen and what the consequences then would be. So then in terms of the risk assessment, so the control measures and the mitigation measures for your risks identified specifically with GBV. Obviously, legal compliance is like, I think Mbali mentioned it at first, earlier, is the highest level of compliance. So we need to ensure that we comply with the legislation. From OSH Act and the Mine Health and Safety Act point of view, it has also been mentioned that it is the employer's responsibility to ensure a safe work environment. So the employer has a responsibility, irrespective of who and what type of employer it is, to ensure that is covered in the risk assessment and that in terms of compliance with the legal requirements. And then also gender-based violence legislation, or the bills and the drafts and that are coming up. Something that's also important is the 𝗘𝘀 Act. So the 𝗘𝘀 Act is relevant to the compensation. Excuse me. The 𝗘𝘀 Act is relevant to industries, but also to the Mine Health and Safety Act. But I believe the 𝗘𝘀 Act doesn't necessarily at this point in time refer to GBV. So we will classify then GBV as assault. So from a stigma point of view, one can also use that as a possibility. So if it is a confidential situation, and there's stigma involved, and maybe try to convince people to not name it for what it is actually, but as point of departure, start with calling it an assault. But definitely, if it happens during working hours or during a working situation, and we've heard about different scenarios already when it is work related, then it has been a work related incident or injury, and it needs to be reported to the Compensation Commissioner. And then from a 𝗘𝘀 Act point of view, there is a specific assault questionnaire that they want us to complete, which will then sort of bring out that specific information in terms of what the type of GBV exposure was. Obviously, incident investigation, you mentioned some earlier that maybe it might not necessarily be, but depending if it's a 𝗘𝘀 case, and depending on the severity and the type of injuries and possible treatment afterwards, incident investigation is necessary, because we need to understand the root causes and where in our workplace can we make some changes to prevent reoccurrence, because that is our ultimate goal. Accurate record keeping is very important. Every little bit of nitty-gritty detail we need to ensure. And then it has also been mentioned before, I think it's critical that we include unions, NGOs, the communities, obviously the SAP, but communities as well. Then the company policies. So yes, zero tolerance was mentioned before, but part of that is also to promote a positive workplace culture. The disciplinary procedure, yes, there are many different procedures and documents that companies do have, must have, but the disciplinary procedure can also then include, for example, the dismissal or the fine, the action that can be relevant for the perpetrators as such. Obviously, we would not like to keep such a person as part of our company. Confidentiality, sensitivity, and the counseling. So that would be part of our trauma counseling afterwards. The confidentiality and the sensitivity is very critical, that it's communicated and emphasized regularly. One can also have, companies can also have online reporting systems. So to start off as an anonymous reporting, to maybe just start the process and make the person feel a little bit more comfortable just to talk about it, but not necessarily give it a name or relate it to a specific person or an incident, and then obviously work it from there. yeah, we spoke about the remote working areas, and then in some of the different industrial situations, there is a buddy system that they talk of. So I'm not sure how valuable or how doable this is in a mining setup. But if it is possible, one would really recommend that a buddy system be used to make sure that we don't really have a possible lone worker or person exposed to those type of things. And yes, the mining industry currently is still a male-dominated industry, leaving the females very vulnerable. But as you also mentioned earlier, it can be the other way around. But yes, for now we speak about the female part of it. And then internal and external service providers. So again, to cover and promote the confidentiality part. So there can be, like you have the hub, the identified department or identified person in a specific department where confidential internal reporting can be part of or managed by, but we can also have external reporting systems or companies where we can report these type of things and events. And then again, with the EAP, company wellness programs are very important. There are external companies as well that one can use as the wellness company, which is also then quite successful in terms of the confidentiality. And they are trained people to handle the sensitivity around that as well. Communication, we mentioned about communication. I think what is critical is that we remember and that we need to keep in mind, and it's not just us on the panel or us on the group, but the annual 16 days campaign that we have is one campaign in a year, 60 days out of 365 days. So we should live beyond that as well. We should also keep it part of our daily lives and also in the workplace. And I'll come to a few pointers there, but keep it part of our daily lives because this is a huge global matter. Induction training has been mentioned. A company can include it in induction training. Continuous training, like I said, not like only the 60 days at the end of the year, but we can have continuous workshops. We can have continuous programs. We can have industrial plays around that. There are many different types of ways that one can communicate the message. From a physical, environmental point of view, workplace environment point of view, there's also posters that one can display on a very regular basis. And there's also internal, companies can use online, internal online options for anonymous information as well. Online programs and articles. Then I just have one slide, if I can call it that I would like to mention the way forward. Like I said, there are many options that one can use. There are many of these, because this is not new, but relatively new from a workplace point of view. We probably will have many trial and error incidents. But what I've read is that the media calls it a cultural problem, and it's in the DNA of mankind. So it is, I think we need to understand how huge this is. So it also put the importance and of the responsibility on each of us to identify, but also to action that. And then in respect of the communication, so I think the workplace is what we are talking about now, but we also need to go back to the community. The community also needs to be involved in terms of upskilling, being made aware of what the definitions, what type, when do we report, schools, definitely tertiary educations, and at home. So it is an enormous wide area of communication that we need to cover. And at the workplace, it cannot necessarily be done all the time and in all the ways, but definitely we can involve those different communities. And then again, my last sentence, we are working with the mothers and the leaders of the future. So we need to work and do our best and involve everyone that we can involve in a group and every group that we can to address and make some effort to see what we can do and how much we can do to get this out of our lives. It's really a bad thing. But that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Krista, for wrapping this up and also just, summarizing it nicely. I mean, my key takeaway from this webinar for me is understanding that it takes each one of us to make a change. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce Chantal Gray, who's going to take us through the Q&A. She is the MD of our webinar partner and sponsor, SafeCloud, who will be sharing some brief info about SafeCloud and assisting me in, like I said, the Q&A. I've seen some of the questions in the chat already. And she's responsible for implementing strategic plans, encouraging creative thinking, spearheading effective communication with all stakeholders, and driving organizational success. In her previous role, Chantal served as MD at Nosa Logistics and Yonke Education and Training Solutions, where she was responsible for transport and warehousing, risk management, training solutions. Over to you, Chantal, and thank you so much for sponsoring this event and partnering with us.
Yeah, it's been an absolutely fantastic partnership, and thank you so much to you, the team at WIMSA, Vanessa and Bali, Krista, for another really fantastic collaboration in addressing such a relevant and real topic that has an impact on us all. And this is also such a timely discussion at the start of the 16 Days of Activism campaign. But of course, we know that the need to address GBV is one that extends way beyond the 16-day period, as already alluded to by Krista. We also know that South Africa has such an unacceptably high rate of violence against women and girls in our communities, our homes, our public spaces, and our schools. And this bleeds over into our workplaces where women are objectified, harassed, and harmed. And it's absolutely not acceptable. And we need to all take a firm stand on this. As the 16-day campaign theme reminds us, there is #no excuse for gender-based violence, not now or not ever. Globally, the 16-day campaign focuses quite strongly on the issues of femicide, highlighting that every 10 minutes a woman is killed globally, and more than 5 women or girls are killed every hour by someone in their own family. But we must remember that GBV and harassment shouldn't need to result in death to be taken seriously. It's even the smallest transgressions, the unwanted comments, the threatening behavior, the ruthless exercise of power that puts women in the workplace at risk each and every single day. I mean, more than 1 in 3 women experience gender-based violence during their lifetime, yet less than 40% of women who experience violence seek any sort of help. So what is quite good to see is that these realities have prompted positive shifts in industry, such as the NCOP that has already been mentioned by both Vanessa and Mbali in this discussion. We've also seen the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources new guidelines under the Mine Health and Safety Act, which form part of a broader initiative to tackle gender-based violence, and the mandating of advanced surveillance systems to monitor and report incidents of harassment or violence in the workplace, as well as the requirements for regular training sessions on gender sensitivity and harassment. And we really commend these shifts for safety for women in this industry and commend WIMSA specifically for the leading role it is playing at putting these issues at the forefront. So with that being said, let's have a look at some of the questions that the audience have been asking during this session. So Mbali, the first question is coming for you from an anonymous attendee, and they are asking, as an organization, where do we start to ensure compliance?
Okay, thank you so much, Chantal. And thank you for the question. So I would start by definitely looking at the MCOP, the guideline on the MCOP, because I think for you to understand what you need to implement, you're going to need to do a gap analysis of what do you have in place versus what you need to have in place. Then concurrently with that, I would say that very importantly, everything that you implement and place in your MCOP must be underpinned by the risk assessment that Krista mentioned earlier. So you have to do that risk assessment, and that is what will assist you as well in determining or identifying whatever mitigation strategies that you'll put in as part of your implementation plan. Now, the MCOP itself requires quite a few obligations, like including the fact that there needs to be a committee that deals with this GBVF issues, as well as not an appointment per se, a legal appointment, but rather a designation of gender focal, persons or ambassadors who are going to be the driving force on the ground for you. So there are quite a few things that you'd need to implement, but all of that can only be identified through doing a gap analysis. You'd also need to consider your current policies. And when I say policies, I'm not just speaking about your harassment policies, but also your disciplinary action policies and anything that you already have in place regarding harassment and GBVF, because they then need to align with what the MCOP says. And then lastly, you need to start putting together your implementation plan, which reporting on that implementation plan is due at the end of February. So it's something really that we need to get a crack on already, because by Feb, the DMRE will start looking at compliance, what the action plans are, what the risk assessments say, who has been designated, and what your organization is actually or has done and is actually going to do to comply. So I want to say this MCOP is not one where you're just going to draft it and complying with it is going to happen overnight. It's going to require quite a bit of work. But your first point of call is understanding what is it that you need to, implement and look at. What is it that you already have? I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, 𝗏𝗀𝗀, a really comprehensive answer, and I hope that that has answered the question to our attendee. Krista, I see your hand is up.
Yes, Chantal, and 𝗏𝗀𝗀, I just wanted to ask the committees that they refer to, or that the document refers to, will it be possible for companies to use the health and safety committees and add it as part of the agenda, or does it define it as a specific different committee?
It doesn't actually specify, Krista. It's actually one of the questions our clients are asking. I think it would be in a company's best interest to look at its current employment equity committee or whatever health and safety committee that they have and see if those people have the qualifications and the competencies to deal with these issues. Because I think what Vanessa mentioned earlier, which is quite important, you need to have a committee that will be gender neutral, but also deal with these things from an expert level. We don't want a situation where this is just another point in your agenda. It has to really be a group of people that are dedicated to managing GBVF within your organization, and oftentimes that requires someone who has certain competencies or qualifications. So it doesn't say, but I think it would be in your best interest to look into that.
Happy, Krista? Cool. Thank you. And then there's a comment from Philo, and she's just very bravely said that the MCOP brings so much hope for women in mining. She says, I left my career as a process engineer in mining after a bullying case, and unfortunately my grievance case was treated casually. I was gaslighted and vilified. Bringing awareness is so worthwhile. I mean, I'm sure this is not the only case that you've heard about in 𝗏𝗀𝗀. Give me a little bit of insights there.
Yeah, agreed. And I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. It's actually, some of the cases we deal with frequently. But I definitely do think that with this MCOP, if companies are actually going to, comply with it, not only comply with it, but actually see the value in what the MCOP brings to their organizations, hopefully we'll have less of these cases and eventually just completely eliminate them, in future.
Absolutely, absolutely. Krista, the next question is directed at you, and it just says, would safety officers be responsible for raising GBV as a health risk and monitoring this? Do you believe that they should raise awareness or prevention training as part of a company's compulsory OHS training requirement?
The last part first, yes, definitely training, awareness, because it might not necessarily be a part of this problem for this company at this point in time. But again, this is where we can include or involve or spread the message to the community, to homes, to other businesses. The safety officer will, if there is a risk, a potential area or a potential risk for these situations to can happen, then definitely it must be a part of the risk assessment, the safety officer, and training, awareness, upskilling can only do good. It cannot harm anyone if you include it in your normal safety training program. I hope that helps.
Fantastic. Thank you, Krista. And then I think the last comment that is made is a very real fear that we see in the industry, where one of our attendees has just commented that it's not always practical to take a senior colleague who is often protected by the company to labor court. It's costly and professionals are usually not included in unions. There's a common phrase that she heard is that you need to have deep pockets and seek justice to seek justice with large companies. This is very disheartening reality, and I think this is a big fear that a lot of women are faced within this industry. So, Vanessa and Bali, what would you suggest to ladies who are experiencing this?
Vanessa, should I let you go first?
No, go right ahead, Bali.
Okay, so unfortunately, this is the reality, and that is why we are sitting with this MCOP on our hands, is that oftentimes reporting senior employees to be taken seriously is very, very difficult. I do just want to say that when it comes to the processes and what should happen, there should be sufficient policies and procedures in place that allow any employee at a workplace to report any sort of harassment, gender-based violence, etc. If the employer does nothing about it, then only can you reach out or should you reach out to the labor court? And there are quite a few attorneys who will act on a pro bono basis or pro amico basis. But once it reaches labor court status, it's at that point where you are also holding the employer vicariously liable. The reason why I'm putting this out there is it shouldn't get to labor court. It shouldn't be expensive, and it shouldn't get to that point where you are feeling despondent because you as an individual are taking another individual or the company to court. So I think use the mechanisms that you have in place internally. And now with this MCOP, that means you will be able to directly liaise with the DMRE and the inspectors on issues related to GBVF as a result of the MCOP. But also, I want to say that I think we've now gotten to the point where it is going to be very difficult for companies to ignore any issues or complaints around GBVF, because this is not only dealt with through the Employment Equity Act and the Code of Practice under, the Labor Relations Act or BCEA, but rather also through the DMRE and the MCOP under the MHSA.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mbali. Vanessa, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so I was just going to come on the tail end of what Mbali was indicating about the plethora of legislation that's available. I don't think that this makes it particularly easy in any instance. And so for me, it is really, really important, that companies begin to think about this differently, and particularly from this idea of a victim-centered approach, because it is quite traumatic. It is very difficult to say to somebody, put your hand up, speak, and make sure that this violence is exposed, but not to be living that trauma that that person is going through. And, from a health perspective, we've dealt with a number of cases. It is traumatic, which is why companies need to ensure, and I'm hoping that they will build into their processes, this idea that you can get psychosocial support or trauma containment. So really that those individuals who do exercise the courage and the bravery have support throughout every single step of the process, and that they also have agency in determining how they would like to see some of these issues resolved. So those two are critical elements that I hope that we can build in through the opportunities that are now provided through the MCOP and the redesign of the processes.
Absolutely. And I think with women showing that they have support in the background from the MCOP, hopefully that encourages them to be more courageous and brave, knowing that they actually have this support behind them. Cool. Excellent. I don't see any more questions coming in, and I think we're spot on time. So thank you so much for all your questions and for everybody's contributions toward today's very, very important discussion. And as we close the session, I'd just like to thank 𝗰𝗀𝗀 once again for your partnerships, and to our speakers for sharing their insights and expertise with us today. So from our side, please stay tuned and sign up for the upcoming webinar series. Keep an eye out on social media from 𝗰𝗀𝗀 and SafetyCloud for our next event, where I hope to see you all there. So for now, stay well, be safe, and stay being courageous. Thank you so much, ladies. Bye-bye.